Good morning, everyone, again, or good afternoon, whatever you are. My name is Adrian Markish, and I am the publisher and editor of ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Predicting Project Outcomes with the subtitle of Requirements Gathering Under the Microscope. Today's featured speaker is Keith Ellis, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Alliances for IAG Consulting. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including a Q&A session. So, of course, make sure to submit your questions in advance and throughout the session using the questions feature of the webinar software. I'd also like to say thank you to IAG for sponsoring this event. At this time, I'll turn over to Keith to get us started.
Adrian, thank you very much. And I am the Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Alliances here at IAG Consulting. And today's discussion is really an advanced seminar for project managers and analysts and development leadership. And we're going to ask some very, very challenging questions. And we're going to look at the facts of project performance because, you know, my thesis is absolutely yes, you can predict the outcome of a project before it ever really gets going. You don't need a crystal ball. You don't need a Ouija board. You don't need any other predictive device. What you need is to look carefully and closely at what's going on the requirements side. And I'm going to give you some hands-on techniques that you can use tomorrow when you're looking at your next strategic project. And this is all from some very hard and fast data that you can pull either from my site, or I think there might even be a copy of the business analysis benchmark up on Modern Analyst, as you can pull from Adrian. But all of this is there, and you can just access those resources. We're going to run the full hour today. I want to see if I can make this as interactive as possible. Adrian, what do we have today? Something like 800 people registered for the session?
Yep, we have about 896 registered.
So let's make it as interactive as possible. Recognize I may not get every single question on the way through, but use and abuse that Q&A area, because what I'll try to do is answer as many of those as I can as I go along. If I don't get your question answered, then I will commit to try to answer it before the weekend, okay? Because that way you can get as much value out of the session as possible for your company, all right? The PDU, CDU information is at the end of the presentation, so you got to stick all the way through it. And the common question that I get, in fact, Brian's already asking it, is that can you get a copy of the presentation slides? And absolutely, you can get those either by sending me an email, kellis@iag.biz, or ask Adrian for that, or you can pull them down directly from the Modern Analyst site. Okay, so without further ado, let's talk about what we're going to get into today. We're going to talk about the facts. And what I mean by that is your takeaway today should be data. You know, it's a challenging position sometimes to be when you're an analyst, you're a project manager, and you're out there and you're working with your stakeholders, and you have to convince them of your position sometimes. And it's good to have in your back pocket some very good facts that you can draw from. And it's going to help you to identify, manage, and control risk, because that's what we're all about as a business function, is to help our stakeholders identify, manage, and control risk, right? All of those facts are from studies that you can pull down from www.iag.biz, and they're the business analysis benchmark and different ones in there. We're going to talk about the front end of the project lifecycle. So often people, when they get into looking at projects, they do the review post factum. Geez, you know what, that one died. What would we want to do better the next time around? You know what, it is better to do the review earlier in the cycle and basically be able to catch things before they ever really are going off the rails or obviously going off the rails. And be able to, if you're looking at it that early in the cycle, you're really looking at the requirement cycle or the intake process. That's where you can take action to take corrective action, bring the project back online. I am going to talk about strategic projects. I mean, that's the bias of our organization is larger scale kinds of activities. But the reality is, you know what, if you mess up on a $20,000 thing, it's not going to kill a Fortune 1000 type class company. If you're on a $10 million thing and you mess up on the requirements, chances are it's going to cost $30, $40, $50 million. That's going to hurt, right? So let's talk about strategic projects, and let's talk about positive actions. And people who have attended sessions that I've done before know that I hate the Chicken Little thing that you get sometimes on sessions like this. You know, I don't want to talk about the sky falling. Yeah, sure, there are issues out there with every organization, and things happen. So the issue is the issue is what kinds of positive
private
actions
reception we're not going to do. She suggested that we got explicit.
Okay, so let's talk about briefly one slide on IAG. We've been at this for something like 13 years, and all we do in life is focus on requirements definition and management. That's our only thing. And so we come at it from one of four perspectives. One is people approach us and they want us to do a project. And so what we'll do is we'll come in, and there may be 30 to 300 stakeholders, and there's a lot of complex issues potentially around that project. And we come in and we help that company execute and get that project done properly. Make sure that the requirements are clean for that project. Sometimes people approach us and say, hey guys, we really like what it is that you do, IAG, in this area of business requirements definition and management. Can you help our organization become mature in that area of requirements definition and management? And that can include things like assessing the organization's maturity, helping them to implement better practices, helping them implement any of the software tools that you see listed at the bottom of the page. We're partners with all of them, and we use all of those on our different engagements. They could come to us and look to us for training activities associated with helping to build the standards and build the competencies within our analyst team. Or sometimes it's just broken, and they come to us to either build a center of excellence or to outsource that center of excellence for requirements, definition, and management within the organization because they need to do it very, very quickly, and they need to make change happen very, very quickly within the organization. So that's our background. That's where we're coming from as an organization, is that requirement specialist organization out there that you might look to. So the learning objectives, and this is one of those cases where, hey, if I don't deliver on this, send me your cranky email. I'll put it right on the back end. Because I want to make sure anytime you're giving up an hour like this, you're getting as much of what you want as possible, all right? So what we want to do here is quantify the impact of requirements quality on time and cost. First and foremost, let's give you the numbers so you see how this is put together. The second thing is give you an assessment tool that you identify those high-risk projects, and it's an area of risk you may not be as familiar with. Like there's a lot of risk assessment tools out there that different people are using in different organizations. The last thing is the proactive strategies for driving success when you're faced with odds stacked against you. And yes, Mark, my email address is going to be on the last slide. So if you're making a request for the slides or something like that, what you can do is send me an email to kls@iag.biz, and it's going to be on the last slide as well. So you can pick it up from there and just make your request. Now, there's a lot of data I'm going to share. Okay, there's a lot of data I'm going to share in this. It's a very heavy presentation. And it comes from a couple of studies. Most notably is the Business Analysis Benchmark, the 2008 version of that study, where we looked at 110 projects that averaged about $3 million in size. So you're looking at strategic projects and the execution of those projects and the impact of requirements quality on the outcome of those projects. You can go to the IAG.biz site and pull that study. You can also pull the 2009 version of that study. It's free. It's there. Register, go download it, and you can take a look. And that will give you the data that we're talking about. But it's important to know where this information is coming from, okay? So it's larger organizations, $3 million on average kind of class projects that you're looking at. But let me challenge you with some questions and some thinking, all right? So here's a scenario, and I'm going to open up a poll in just a second. This is your opportunity for forced participation. Your organization is poor at doing business requirements. You've got the newest $3 million strategic initiative. Should you be concerned? And I'm going to open up that poll right now just to create a little bit of a dialogue here. Good. So we've got lots of people participating today. So we've got, you know what, it's about, and the numbers tend to be about this consistent all the time, right? It's about 90, 95% will say yes, about 4% will say no, I don't need to be concerned. And I bet the 4% are the hardcore agilists out there. But, you know, the reality is that requirements are like this. If you say to people in an audience generically, you say, listen, you're not, the organization, we know they're not great at doing requirements. We've had real problems in the past. Should we be concerned? And the answer will be, well, yeah, but do they take action as a result of that? And the result is almost invariably no, they don't. It's like weight loss, all right? Everybody knows that to lose weight, you got to exercise more and you got to eat less. Everybody knows this. But we have an epidemic of obesity in North America and around the world today. People know what they need to do, but they don't necessarily take action. And that's one of the issues when you're dealing with the world of requirements. And let's talk about those projects that we were looking at, all right? What we did is we broke it out into thirds, all right? The lowest third, the middle third, the upper third. And what this is thirds in terms of the competencies of the requirements team and the quality of the requirements. And what you're seeing there is the success rates on the project. So what you've got are basically two classes of companies. 2/3 of these companies are what I would call Scenario 1 companies. And Scenario 1 is basically, yeah, you know, they might be successful sometimes, but it's improbable. It is more likely that they will have a failure or a mediocre project than the company will be to have a success. And that's 2/3 of companies that we looked at. The Scenario 2 companies, they initiate a project, they're likely to be successful. Likely. Why? Because 72% of their projects historically, they're successful. Okay? So people tend to have issues coming right out of the gate. And they tend not to look at it and quantify for themselves the impact that that's going to have. So I'm going to ask you guys to start thinking about which one of those categories are you in, and let me kind of quantify it for you even further. If you're an organization that feels, yeah, you guys, they're poor at doing requirements, this is inverted from the prior slide, chances are you're paying about 60% more for your applications than the organization that's optimal in doing requirements. 60% more in time and cost, okay, for your applications in an organization that's optimal. Even if you're in the middle, you say, yeah, we're about average. Chances are you're paying about 36% more for your applications than the organization that's optimal, all right? And I challenge you today to say, is mediocre, is the middle of the pack, is that okay for organizations? How many of you today would pay 36 more for a car? The exact same car, pay 36% more for it. Very few. How many people here would pay 36% more for a pizza, right? Chances are very few. But we accept this in information technology, even though it is quite possible to change it. And so you have to step back and say, why is this happening? And here's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to show you. I need you to pick which one you are. Are you the Scenario 1 company, which is kind of average or poorer in doing requirements, or do you think you're excellent at doing requirements? I need you to mentally pick which one you are. Write it down on a sheet of paper in front of you if you have to, okay? Pick one. Is your organization excellent at doing requirements, or are you kind of average or poorer at doing requirements? And what I want you to do is take a look at the Scenario 2 definition, because if this doesn't look like your company, you may not be a Scenario 2 organization. Those companies that focused on doing business requirements and executing consistently had 73% of their projects turning out to be a success, and only the rare project was a failure. 54% of that group's projects were delivered on time, on budget, and on function. I have to challenge you. The folks that said you look like a Scenario 2 company, do you look like this? Are you that consistent about on time, on budget, on function performance? And the reality is that a lot of organizations, they overestimate where they're at. And they really are more like the Scenario 1 organization. You know what? You're more likely to deliver a marginal project or an outright failure than a success. So a lot of what you're doing in the organization is mediocre. You're working very hard, and you've got really, really sharp people driving interesting, solid projects. It's just the outcomes are not as good as you would like. They're mediocre. And you've got a fixed 50% chance of a runaway. which is any two of, yeah, this, Jerry, you've asked this question, any two of 160% of budget, 180% of time, or less than 70% of functionality delivered. Jerry, any two of those is what a runaway means, okay? And this group here expends about 50% more money on their applications, about 40-odd% more time. So does that change your thought on where you're at? Yeah, maybe you're not quite scenario 2. Maybe you look somewhat like scenario 1, but maybe it's in between somewhere. Chances are the organization does not have that level of maturity, right? Does not necessarily have that level of maturity that you need to have, and you should be concerned in driving through and making sure you're improving the way you do requirements. And Daniel, what techniques do I recommend to identify unmet needs and goals of the users? That's a really good question. It's also a long one to answer, okay? So the kinds of things I would focus in on is making sure you're dealing with the what and not the how first and foremost. And so what is it that the business wants to accomplish? And there's a lot of ways you can do that. There's a lot of techniques that you would do that. But it's a separation of business and technology first and foremost. And then what I typically do is I also focus in on that business process. So when you're talking and you're connecting all requirements back to the business process, what you tend to be much more able to do is to make sure that you have the requirements in context to the business. And so there are a lot of different ways of doing that. You might be using use cases, sometimes you'll be using user stories. There's a lot of different techniques that you might be to use that. But I'm going to make a suggestion that there's a, I think it's on the Modern Analyst site, look at a webinar called Optimizing Requirements Discovery, because it's all about that set of techniques that you might look at, or just send me an email and I'll respond back having a little bit more time to answer that one. So with that, recognize that 94 or whatever it is % of you said, 96% said, yeah, I should be concerned. And I'm going to bet that 96% of your peers also said, yeah, I should be concerned. But the vast majority of them failed to deliver projects that were successful. The vast majority of them failed to deliver projects that were successful, and most of those were ones that didn't do a great job on the requirements. Okay? Now, which is more dangerous? A $3 million implementation impacting 27 employees and aimed at cutting costs, or a $3 million portal impacting 400 employees aimed at sharing critical forms and information? So which is more dangerous? I'm going to launch that poll, and as that poll is playing out, I'm going to answer some questions. So Robert, aren't runaway scenarios also product of poor project management as well? Yeah, that would also be true. Okay, so, well, depending, because sometimes the analyst and the project management function are together, and you may or may not be separating these two. So it's true that there is a shared responsibility in this area for a couple of these things, and you can't just say it's the domain of business analysis one way or the other. How do you sell the functional areas and the need for quality requirements up front? So part of what we're doing today, Tony, is answering that question. It's helping them to sell it up front. And by the time we're done, you should have more than enough information on that particular one. Otherwise, you drive them in to have some conversations with us in the webinars and things like that to help them see. But the real challenge is here, Tony, is take away one fact, is that 70% of requirements fail. When projects fail, 70% of the time it's related to the requirements. And there's a dozen studies on that. One of the best ones you can look at is the business analysis benchmark data. So we've got 70-odd% of people who have voted now. So let's take a look at the answers on this one, okay? And I'm going to share it with you just to prove that 78% of people said the $3 million project impacting 400 employees, all right? And so what I end up having to do now is explain why 78% of people on the webinar here are unfortunately incorrect. And the reason being is because there is a type of risk that people tend to forget about, and it's called requirements elicitation risk, which is all about how difficult it is to go get the requirements on a particular project class. And so most people say, oh, no, large number of stakeholders for 2 equal-sized projects, that's what's creating the risk. And the reality is that that may or may not be actually that risky a project. So you need to step back and take a look at that. So Alex, examples of actual practical uses of use cases, yeah, if you go on to iag.biz, you can pull down the IAG template and a sample, and that has a use case-centric version for you if you want to look at that. Or you can email me and say, hey, Keith, I want to see the sample template or the sample requirements documentation using use cases, and I'll send that off to you, okay? But remember, 900 folks participating today. You need to send me the note, and then I'll turn around and send it back to you at the end, okay? Let me show you some numbers around this. And yes, Whitney, I will deal with your question on SMEs that don't understand requirements development processes. That one is a great question. I'm going to answer it at the end of this section, though. The proportion of projects that fail to meet business objectives by the type of objective. So there are two types of companies. Remember, scenario one, scenario two. The scenario two companies are actually quite boring because they always or tend to meet the objectives. The scenario one companies that aren't as good at doing requirements are the ones that are interesting. Okay, so that's what I'm mapping out here. And as you can see, what you have is this domain, this spectrum. And Tina, yeah, you can. Your CIO is Colin. I'd suggest you take that particular one. But there is a recording of the webinar, and if you want, send a note to Adrian, and he can give you the location, or send a note to me, and it's in the slide deck where the location is. What you see is, to the right, anytime an organization is changing its business processes, the risk is higher, and the slides should change over for you. It's just a little bit hung up for you right now, so you can't see the slide as easily as you like. So what happens is the higher the degree of process change, the higher the degree of process change, the higher the failure rate in projects. When you're dealing with something like regulatory compliance, so you get limited exposure to process change or better internal management information, which was the example that I gave you, okay, in the survey question, 78% have said, yeah, that's higher risk. The reality is those ones have far lower failure rates. And the underlying issues in here are, what do you have to have as competency to be successful in any of those two scenarios? And so in the case to the right, the more you're dealing with significant amount of process change, the more you have to have an elicitation methodology that you rely on to help you get the requirements, to know the right questions to ask at the right time. On the flip side, you can rely on personal subject matter expertise to drive the project, to drive the questioning, and drive getting the requirements. But you can't when you've got high degrees of process change, because the reality is it's all about bringing together the business stakeholders that own those business areas cross-functionally and saying, okay, guys, let's talk about how this is going to work in the future, and then aligning that to the business application. And Pradeep, you're asking about effective tools that you can use to gather reporting requirements. There's a lot of them, actually. We track about 100-odd tools in this particular area. The ones that we've chosen to partner with are listed on the IAG slide. So we've done a lot of work with IBM. There's some good tooling around iRise, which is more of a visualization tool. There's some great tooling in the, there's some mid-market stuff and around eDev, et cetera, that's got Integrate, and there you got some interesting stuff. If you're a little more technically oriented, Enterprise Architect is good from Spark Systems. So a whole lot of them out there. It really depends on what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish with the kind of tooling, et cetera. So if you're more use case centric and that's what you're trying to implement, you might even look to something like a Ravenflow, right? So there's a lot of differences between these two, right, in terms of what you're trying to accomplish. And Whitney, part of this speaks to your question is, if you're trying to get them to understand the requirements process, you've got to explain to them, well, what's in the process, and also why is it important to follow through in a good requirements process, because you want them to achieve their business objectives, right? In terms of the success rates, okay, let's take a look at the size. So in the poll itself, I said the number of users, okay? So here what you see is actually, I was expecting that it would go downward to the right. Okay, again, scenario 2 companies, very, very boring because they are just generically successful, although they are noticeably less successful on the smaller ones. On the bigger ones, okay, but what happens is you've got a scenario or a set of companies or a set of projects which it's bipolar. if you have a very low number of stakeholders or a very, very high number of stakeholders, you tend to have very high failure rates. And that blew me away. I looked at that and said, like, what is going on with this? That doesn't make a lot of sense. So speaking to your question here, Laurie, it's basically saying, how does this tie together in terms of the number of users? Well, the issue is, why would that possibly happen? And I suspect what happens is when you're dealing with very small numbers of stakeholders that are being impacted, right, or employees that are being impacted, then people tend to relax a lot of the disciplines. They tend to get pulled away from the kinds of things that you need to focus on to make the project successful, versus that kind of middle of the road, hey, it's big enough, people are, very focused on it, it impacts a fairly large number of people, and it's following through on the regular project management kinds of principles that are involved. Then the very, very large ones are just that much more complicated, and they tend to have higher failure rates, right? So if you're doing, Dan, you're saying business process reengineering, and you're trying to implement a solution at the back end, yeah, you're going to have potentially much higher failure rates unless you're very good at defining the processes using a requirements elicitation methodology, okay? And you drive that systematically. So what I'm trying to do here is kind of bring out some of these ideas for you so that you can use the baseline, use that in helping you to identify risk within your organization. So now one last question. Now, 70-odd%, you got the last one wrong, okay? So let's go through this next one. How critical are your business analyst team in controlling project scope? And this speaks to one of the earlier questions I had, the relationship between the analysts and the project manager organization. You need to have great analysts to control the scope, or you have great project managers and you can control scope even if you have average or poorer analysts. It's really that average or poorer versus you've got to have great analysts to control project scope. Challenging question, isn't it? I can always tell how many analysts I have on this call based on the answer to this question. So I'm going to cut that off right now, okay, and show you the answers. We have a preponderance of analysts on this call. When I do this with project management groups, then I'll get almost the inverted numbers, which is what it is, right? So, but 74% of people saying we need great analysts to control scope. 26% of people saying we've got great PMs and we can control scope with average analysts. And that's, practically that's the situation that most of you are in. It's average analysts, right? That's just what's going on. So let's look at the numbers, the facts, and see what it says, okay? Because that's what I'm very interested in. Let's get past, oh, this is my area, your area, this is their domain, my domain. Let's look at the facts of what people are saying and what we're finding in the surveys, okay? There's a very tight relationship in here. It's very symbiotic, all right? And so there's a multiplier effect between analyst and the project management team and the scope control activities of the project management team. If you've got very poor elicitation skills, which is a sub-part of the analyst capability, all right, you will have poor scope control in the majority of project situations. So it doesn't matter how good that team is of project managers, you're going to have scope control issues. The analysts which excel at elicitation had excellent scope control in 95% of projects. That's staggering. Look at the differences, right? Look at the differences. Not explainable by purely the skill level of the project manager themselves. Companies that had both, they were excellent at scope control, they were excellent at elicitation, 80% of those projects were successful. So very significant differences in here, and that there's a tight relationship between what I'll call elicitation excellence and scope control. So here's, if you're a project manager, and it looks like about a quarter of the people on the call are project managers. If you're a project manager and you are looking at the scope documentation prepared by your analyst team, the quality of that documentation is predictive of the likely success overall on your project. So if is not good. It sucks. You should walk and not run from that analyst team, okay? You've got to fix that situation because it is very probable that you will have a failure. If you're an analyst team out here and you're not good at requirements definition planning, the planning and scoping stage, you've got to fix that because you have a high probability of failure. Okay, you need to look at that as an area within here. Now let me kind of hammer this one home for people, okay? What we did is we looked at the underlying competencies of the analyst team on these projects. Now remember, these are $3 million projects. They're not little itty-bitty things, all right? So this isn't we assigned it to Joe because he's new here. You're talking about fairly significant projects. And so what we said is, what was the average skill level of the analysts on these projects that controlled the scope plus or minus 10%? In other words, they delivered the project plus or minus 10% on budget, on time, and on function. And Jessica, I'll answer your question in just a sec, okay? They delivered plus or minus 10% on time. Now, the blue zone is plus or minus 1 standard deviation, all right? So if I'm correct on this, okay, in my little thesis that says requirements dramatically impact the ability to control time, budget, and scope of the project, then these 3 zones that I'm now using my little highlighter to highlight will be radically different in their numbers, okay? So the average on time, on budget, on function performance in each of those 3 zones will be dramatically different, all right? And that's exactly what happens, okay? The guys that were to the left of 1 standard deviation average 190% of budget. The guys in the middle, 163. The guys to the right, 121% of budget, okay? Radical, radical, radical change. Now, here's the frightening one. What was the average skill level used? The average skill level used, right in here, about 58. Guess what zone that's in? It's in this zone over here. Okay, it's way to the left. And that's the reality of most situations. So it should not be a surprise when you see Standish and these other reports saying, hey, we're still experiencing very high failure rates, because people tend to recognize the importance of requirements, but they tend not to take definitive action. They tend not to change behavior to deal with that situation. So let me help you identify situations where you have likely failure, okay, where you need to step back and say, is it possible? Now, to me, the gap is fairly simple. The gap is really organizations are trained to look at and assess project risk. A lot of organizations do that very, very effectively and efficiently. But they may not be trained to identify what I call requirements elicitation risk. And it's a different class. It's a different type of thing. And it came out in the bias of the survey where 78% of people said, oh, the one with more people is the higher risk. Where the reality is it's more about the business objectives and more about, hey, wait a minute, if we got a whole lot less people in here, and it's impacting very small, chances are we have a very high failure rate. And recognizing that's part of the elicitation risk. So let me provide this tool to you so that you can use that in your data. Now, it's not going to replace. It's very simple, right? It's not going to replace. But let me also answer these 2 questions. So, Jessica, what about instances where the business changes the priority requirements frequently? Yeah. In that case, you have to question the elicitation techniques that were used. Because so often what happens is the approach that was taken was not systematic enough. That you built a layer of understanding, and then below that layer of understanding, drill down, build out that layer of understanding, drill down, build down. So it looks like things are changing very frequently. But in reality, people had a more stable understanding of what they wanted to do. Also, sometimes this happens, very, very frequently it happens, when the requirements are disconnected from the business process itself. So if you bring it back to the business process and how that functions, you get much more stable requirements typically, okay? So there's a couple of things. Question slides. Yes, if you want the slides, Walter, not a problem. Send me an email to kls@iag.biz, and I will turn around and send it back to you. Also, if you go up on the site, www.iag.biz, there's a ton of stuff there. There's probably 24 white papers, whole lot of web blogs, a whole lot of video blogs, tons and tons of stuff. There's maybe 100 pieces of content related to the analyst world on that site if you want to go get it, okay? So let's go into the tool itself and start looking at this. Now remember, every one of these questions I provided stats on to you. There's one client of, one organization I was working with that said, oh, well, we can just apply the stats in here and we can predict the actual problem. No, don't do that. No, it's getting a little over the top, right? Because, but let's just identify it as high risk and low risk. Okay, so if you have historical requirements quality, you look at that. What I need you to do is think about your last strategic project or your next one that you're working on. Have that in the top of the back of your head, okay? Think about the last one you worked on or the next one that you're going to be working on. And I want you to ask yourself candidly, what is your historical requirements quality? Is it average or below? If it is, what were we talking about in the stats? It's high risk, right? In the stats, it's over here. If it's below, if you're exceptional at doing this, give yourself a check in the green. So often that's what we need, a pat on the back. The next one is the number of stakeholders impacted. Again, if it's very small or very large, in other words, on average for your company, what's the average number for a strategic project? What's the average number of stakeholders you're dealing with? If you've got substantially smaller than that or substantially larger than that, what is the risk profile of that project? Very high. Again, so what you're dealing with is a scenario where it's a $3 million on average strategic project, but it's impacting a very small number of stakeholders. That's a very high-risk project. You've got to categorize it as that because they will push back and they'll give you problems on following the process. They will not follow through necessarily on the commitments on the requirement side. So you need to make sure you're managing it very closely. The degree of process change expected to achieve the business requirements. Remember what we had talked about. If you've got very high degrees of process change expected, what happens? That's right, very high risk. Thank you, Brian. The competency of the analyst team on this project, it may be that historically you've not been very good at doing the requirements. So what do you do? If the competency of the analyst team has dramatically changed, then it's either high or low risk, right? And then you've got to say, what's the quality of requirements that have been done for the scope on this project? And remember, again, that's all related to the statistics that we just shared with you. Remember, if the scoping stuff is done poorly, what does that mean to your project? You have to run and not walk from that analyst team because likely you're going to have a significant problem with that project. So this is not replacing all of your tooling around assessing project risk. I want you to think about the last strategic project. What did I say about few stakeholders? Okay, so it's bipolar, Dan. If you got very low number or very high number relative to what your project typically does, then it is high risk. Oddly enough, very few stakeholders for a large spend on a project is as risky as very large numbers of stakeholders for that same large spend on a project. It is a bizarre outcome. It is what it is. But you have to call that out to your people and say, look, historically, project failure rates are very high when we're dealing with a fairly large spend for a fairly low number of stakeholders. We're going to really have to focus in on this requirements discovery process. You guys are probably saying, oh, yeah, but we can just do this quickly. No, you can't. You need to focus on doing it very, very well and set that expectation. Use the data here to help you manage stakeholder expectations on the project and get around that, okay? So taking action and achieving success. Like once in a while, you're going to flunk the test, right? You're going to have 4, checks in the red, and you're going to say, okay, well, ouch, what am I going to do about that? So here's some ideas for you. 2 strategies to use when the odds are stacked against you. And I'm going to have to move a little faster so I can get done by the end of this thing. So because it's going to happen from time to time. You're going to have problems, right? And you're not going to try to redefine the entire requirements definition management process of your company. You're going to try to deal with it on this particular project. And you want to make sure you're taking action that's going to work. So you need to do things like this, 2 strategies. First one is define standards for requirements quality on this particular project, okay? And what that means is you need to start thinking about how you're going to define quality, because, you know, stakeholders working on it, the analysts working on it, the project managers working on it, everybody's working on requirements, and, you know, you're going to have multiple different opinions. So you have to bring people together on as to what does that mean in terms of what do good requirements mean for the organization. So there's 3 things that I looked at, okay? Yeah, Irene, just send me an email to kls@iag.biz, and then I will turn around and send you back the slides, okay? No problem. By the way, that email address will be on the last slide in the deck. The first thing I said is it needs to be clear, measurable, insightful. And what that is you don't want a situation where you're talking to the analyst, oh, yeah, these are good requirements. No, they're not. Oh, yes, they are. No, they're not. That doesn't make sense, right? So it has to be clear. How do you measure it, by the way? And then, you know, when you look at it and you realize that this problem, it's insightful as to what it is you need to do. The second thing is it needs to be predictive. So whatever measure we use for assessing quality has to have some sort of predictive effect. So, you know, diagnosing a defect has to have a high correlation to a bad outcome. Also, it has to have a meaningful impact. So if you fix it, then there's a strong positive benefit. Now, recognize for a second that when we audit requirements, we look at a lot more things than this. What I'm giving you is a simple version. What I would suggest you look at if your organization is lower or mid-level maturity, okay? What I suggest you look at are only 3 things. 3, just 3, okay? They're challenging, but there's 3. One is, does the documentation of the process include the information required to support the process? Now, you said look at the requirements, and now all of a sudden you're talking about a process. You just took a left turn on me here, Keith. I don't understand where you're going. Well, let me explain. If you're doing requirements for a transactional system, you need to make sure that the requirements are always done in the context of the business process. Secondly, what does that mean? You need to elaborate the business process, how the business is going to work. What does the business want to do, right, before you get into the how? The second part is you need to look at, under the covers here a little further, you need to look at when you're describing the business and how it works, how detailed is that? Is it sufficiently detailed that you're getting down into how information moves, okay? So, Mark, you're asking about predictive. What I'm talking about in predictive is, can you realistically predict that the project is likely to be successful or likely to fail as a result of looking at tangible characteristics of the project, okay? So in this case here, if the documentation doesn't get down to really describing how information flows underneath the process, it's not sufficiently detailed enough to be able to guide and be true requirements for a project. And it's like this. If you ask how something works and you give a description, you might draw a series of bubbles on a page, process flow diagram. And then you ask how does this one step work? And then you ask how does that one step of a step work? And then you ask how does that one step of a step of a step work? Increasingly what you'll hear is people describe information movement rather than process movement, okay? And so if it's not sufficiently detailed, it's very hard to do. The second thing is, are interdependencies identified? System, process, project. This is very simple to identify in a requirements documentation. Does it have a context diagram? Interfaces, are they defined? All these other basic things are fairly simple kinds of things to look for. But if the interdependencies are not identified, the actual scope or domain of the system is really not well understood. And the last thing is, are the goals and objectives unambiguous? So somebody was asking about projects sliding all over the place and what happens if this project is moving around a lot and the requirements are changing. It may be on that project that the BA failed to help the organization achieve clear understanding of the goals and objectives for the project as a whole and how the process is going to work underneath it. As a result of that, the project became very dynamic, which is not a good thing for a project, okay? You don't want dynamic because it'll move around. Now, auditing these things, let me show you some numbers, okay? Because I'm all about numbers. People should know that about me by now. If you are poor in those 3 areas, just those 3, you are the blue chart, which means you've got about historically when we did the assessment on this, 18.8% of companies that were poor in those 3 areas, 18.8% of them were successful. You get the mirror image of that if you fix this. Now, it doesn't mean that you get great projects. Doesn't mean that you get star raving successes. In fact, the majority of the projects are neither successful nor unsuccessful. But it does mean that you eliminate about 80% of your failures. And if you did this, now remember, average project in here that's doing this is overrunning by about 300%. So fixing it and saving $630,000 is like, okay, you've taken your $8 million project and made it $7 million, something like that. But more importantly, you do deliver 27% more of the target functionality. So people are actually satisfied with it once you get it out the door, as opposed to being really, really upset because, you know, they only got about 60% of what it is that they wanted to get, and frankly, it's a challenge. Okay, they're really challenged. Yeah, Hannah, if you go onto the IG website, yeah, you'll get some requirements templates that are phenomenal. Oh, so just send me a note and say, hey, Keith, I'd like that that spreadsheet or that template, and I'll turn around and send you an example, all right? Strategy number 2 is separating your mind documentation methodology from elicitation methodology, all right? Separate those two. And I'm going to make a statement here that it'll throw some people off. Requirements are not a document. I know that messes people up when I say that. Requirements are not a document. Requirements are a process. The result of that process is an artifact. Happens to be a document sometimes, may not, could be models. That artifact is requirements. So you have to say requirements are a process, the result of which is a document. If the process sucks, how likely is it that the document is going to be any good? It's pretty unlikely, right? The process for doing the requirements is really good. How likely is it that the requirements are going to be really good? Much more likely. So you've got to separate these two. Yeah, you're asking about Agile. That always comes up. In fact, the similar kinds of principles apply in Agile because you always have that common denominator of understanding business need. You must bake into your process understanding business need. The way you do it in Agile is very, very different. So there's just different techniques involved in doing it, but you must adhere to all of the things we're talking about in this discussion. You will have the same kinds of strategic problems in this as I'm sharing with you in this discussion, okay? So let's talk about what this means. Documentation quality is really all about, so let's say you're good at documentation quality. You get the curve, the success rate curve, like what's on the left here. It's all about, however, preventing failures. Elicitation excellence, which is the process of doing the requirements, is all about creating success. Two vastly different concepts. You cannot have lousy documentation quality and elicitation success. You know what I mean? If you have lousy documentation quality, it doesn't matter how good your elicitation is, frankly, your project's going to go nowhere. If you have both and you have that creating of excellence, excellent projects come from an excellent, excellent process of doing the requirements. So some closing thoughts, and I'm delighted I made it through on time and still answered, looks like about 50 or so questions. You can absolutely, I'm hoping everybody walks away from this discussion saying, you can absolutely predict the outcome of a project based on the quality of business requirements. I probably had, I don't know, 12 different charts. And if you don't believe this particular study, we did it again. We did it in 2009. It's called the Business Analysis Benchmark. It's much, much more detailed in terms of the stats. I think it was about four times the size in terms of the sampling size, and we looked at a number of different parameters. We also defined the maturity. So what does it mean to include or to improve an overall organization and success? Dan, typically I don't include the notes on my slide. On the slide deck I sent out, I just sent out the slides themselves. And I don't actually have a lot of notes on my thing, but you can go back through if you really want. You can go get the, you can watch it again on either Modern Analyst or the IG site, and then you can kind of pick it up and take some more notes from there. The cost of poor requirements quality is excessive, and I hope you've taken that away, okay, that the cost of poor requirements quality is, in fact, excessive. Now, here's the kicker. I'm betting 68% of people probably also knew that above information. In fact, 96, I think was the percentage, 96 or 94% of you at the beginning of this thing said, yeah, you know what, we're historically poor on doing our requirements. I should be concerned. 68% of these people probably also knew that information, but they did not take meaningful action on their last strategic project as a result of knowing that information. And that's the challenge. That's the issue that people face at its root, is people tend not to take action. It's like weight loss. People know they got to eat less, exercise more, but we have an epidemic of obesity going on in North America today. So with that, I've got a lot more questions coming in. Thank you very much for everybody's time and attention today. I'm going to take about 7 minutes I have left to answer as many of these questions that are floating in as I possibly can. But for those of you who are asking me, can you get my slides? Absolutely. Send me your email to kls@iag.biz. If you get tired of typing that in, send it over to Adrian. He will also have the slide deck, and we can get that out. PDU, CDU information is on the screen in front of you. Make sure you take a screenshot of that. And if you're collecting PDUs in particular, you probably want us to send to you the certificate, so that's not a big deal. The 5 categories of elicitation excellence, Janet, I can get you that information. It's best just to look at the business analysis benchmark study. The better way to look at it, and I think because you're asking really about overall performance improvement and how to improve the analyst function, is to look at it from the perspective of maturity. Requirements, discovery, and management maturity, and how do you increase from a level 1 maturity to a level 5, which is a much more systematic way of looking at it rather than just say, hey, let's build elicitation excellence. Elicitation excellence, by the way, categories things like the how tight is the stakeholder, how short are the stakeholder meetings. It's things like if they're efficient. It's things like, just off the top of my head, I'm having trouble kind of coming up with them. But requirements, definition, and management, so it's getting requirements in a concentrated period of time, consensus on requirements efficiently, effective meetings and use of stakeholder time are the key issues in elicitation excellence. Now, from your perspective, however, the broader path to success is maturity overall, and there are really 6 underlying capabilities that you want to look at. It's your requirements process, the techniques that you're using, the technologies that you're using in there, the organization and how it's structured, the competencies of your analysts, and invariably I'm missing one, the deliverables. Okay, so look at those and say, you know, how do I go from, you know, maybe not having defined what my practice techniques, et cetera, are, all the way through to you've institutionalized and optimized those. And that's what maturity is all about. So I think about that as one of those areas that you want to spend. How do you manage successful elicitation when you don't get to talk to the stakeholders directly in most projects? Okay, so that's a challenging one, Stephanie. I'm not sure your particular business situation is creating that. But if you've got a situation where you truly have very limited access to your stakeholders, what you have to do is you have to do a proxy for it. And this is not ideal. This is the, gosh, you know, I'll tell you about this, but it's not ideal in any stretch. So you come to me and I'll tell you about some technologies that allow you to extract the business process from the existing systems. And it's not so much reverse engineering, it's basically extracting the user interaction with the systems from how they're managing and walking through. And then, so when you've got that in the background, that allows you to get a blueprint of the higher level business process structures and what you're using. And then what you do is you take it from there to go into a discussion with your stakeholders, because then you're compressing it down. For the most part, we candidly don't have the problem so much that you're talking about, where you're not able to directly interact with your stakeholders. And a lot of that is driven by the quality of your requirements definition management plan. You need to say, hey, this is what we need to accomplish as a business. We're going to need this set of interactions to accomplish the outcome that you're talking about, which is implementing this type of system. And candidly, if you're not willing to give us the amount of time that we need to do it, then we have an issue collectively as an organization. And so that's the challenging part, is to be able to stand up and say, well, how much time do I need? And then be able to deliver the requirements within that time frame that you've now set, because you've set a higher level of expectation. And most of the time, what we find is that if you can tell a set of business stakeholders, I need this amount of time and no more to do this level of outcome on these projects, then people will give you that. This last one that we're doing, we've got 150 or so stakeholders that are involved. across 4 different states, and we're bringing them together and we're running those people through thousands of hours of meetings on trying to get the requirements structured. You can do that so long as they know in advance, I'm going to need this person on this day for this long, that kind of thing. What about getting the requirements BA peer-reviewed before or after stakeholder approval? Sukumar, excellent, absolutely excellent. You need to look at peer reviewing, and it will dramatically improve your requirements quality. You typically do that before going for stakeholder approval, because people get married to the document, okay? And you should have a set of things that people are looking for, because what happens is people go and do the peer review, and they focus in on the crossing of the T and the dotting of the I and how this is spelled or how that's articulated, whereas that's really not as relevant as, the completeness of the document from the perspective of the information content and types, the coverage of the use cases, the other kind of things. The fact that you missed crossing a T somewhere, come on, it's a spelling mistake. Yeah, you'd like to eliminate that kind of stuff, but in the grand scheme of things, that's not what's going to push the project off. If you're missing the context diagram, yeah, that's going to create a big hole in your project because you only have half the scope understood, that sort of stuff. So you got to educate people on what it is that they should be looking for. How do you get a project team to address these issues when they're on a tight delivery timetable? Whitney, you'd send them to me for that one, because I'll tell you, let's say we're dealing with a $1 to $2 million project, okay? Just for argument's sake. And I don't want to do a lot of bravado, but the reality is that you can do great requirements in a hyper-compressed timetable. $1 to $2 million project for me, in our organization is probably 5 to 10 business days. Client-side spend, okay, $1 to $2 million. So, so you're building a $1 to $2 million application, including development and everything. The requirements activity on that, 5 to 10 business days to take you to a business requirements, middle-level use case in articulated detail, conceptual data model in place, the process flow understood to a mid-level of detail, all these other sorts of things, the business rules, et cetera, et cetera. So it doesn't need to take forever. It's about the elicitation techniques that you're using. What's the website? PMI's website is pmi.org. That's a skill testing question on my part. Do you consider owners of the process as the stakeholders? Yeah, invariably they would be. Depends on what process we're talking about here and what kind of stakeholders we're talking about. But generally when I'm referring to doing requirements work, the stakeholders would be people who are impacted by or owning the process. And you've got 2 classes. You've got stakeholders who are subject matter experts, and you've got stakeholders who are the managers. And you'd need to involve both classes at different times in the requirements definition management process. Okay, happy to send them along. Tired of beating my head against the wall. Sure, Whitney, just send them in my direction. Not a problem, because all you need, the issue is going to be if they are on a hyper-compressed timetable, you need to get them into a more efficient elicitation methodology, and you can also share with them by doing that kind of approach, right? By doing that kind of approach, it is more likely that their project will be delivered on time and on budget, as opposed to 60% overdue and blah, 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 blah. So it's a very faux thing, thinking that, because you're coding next week, the project is going to move forward faster. In fact, that's just not the case. So with that, I am right on the money in terms of the timing. Thank you very much for your participation today, and I wish you all great success. Over to you, Adrian.
Hey, thank you, Keith. Thank you for a great presentation. Of course, thank you for everyone who attended the this webinar. As Keith mentioned, the webinar along with the slides will be archived after the event. You can also send a note to Keith, flood his inbox with emails. He's going to love it. He's going to have to respond to lots of them. Again, thank you again for everybody, and this concludes today's event. Hope you have a great day.